right. Well, I was looking at movies that I wanted to use for illustration, so I figured this morning I would use The Titanic and The Notebook, because I realized we all love those. As Steve ratted me out, I cried during The Notebook. My wife says.
Aren't you watching Downton Abbey too?
I do watch Downton Abbey, but I've got a conversation to have with you about that one. Come on, you got an Irish rebel?
Really?
I'm not going to defend it here. I'll lose. You guys, I don't know if you're catching on to the theme. Here's kind of what we talked about as a group. We, on Saturday mornings, we've been attempting to do just little pot shots at different topics and having different people come in and speak, and felt like it was kind of a disjointed effort as a group as far as where we were headed. So for the last 6-8 months, almost a year, we've been sitting down and talking about, as a group of people that meet regularly on Saturday mornings, what would be productive, what would be helpful for us to know as a community while we're kind of going through life together. So that's kind of what we've been talking about. We had Rob come on during the family dinner, and he gave us a teaching that was Genesis to Revelation. It was everything in the Bible, and it was kind of like the summary of how to understand that God is telling the same story. He's the same God. We're the same people He created. There's not a whole lot of disjointed confusion in all that. And he did his college professor attempt at summarizing, which went over a little bit in my head. But ultimately, his summary, I mean, he gave us the gospel in 3 words, I think, which is better than I could have done. Went over yours too? But essentially, what he kept saying was, we spent a lot of time in the past as a church all together telling Old Testament, New Testament stories and trying really hard to make them fit together. And he said, really, they're not difficult to fit. It's the same God, it's the same heart, it's the same pursuit. So that's kind of what we're after. The thing that we're trying to get after is what it is we're supposed to be doing. So if we can understand the story that God's been telling since the beginning of time, then it gives us an idea of where we stand in that story. So how we contribute, what role we're supposed to play. If we don't understand that story, it's kind of confusing. But I think we understand life as stories, right? Is anybody in here like math? Be honest.
Yeah.
We okay with it?
I'm okay with math.
Do you understand your life or your family's life or the things that go on as math equations?
No.
Even the people that like math. Like, are those the things that matter? Like, if you said what mattered, would you go through as a math person and would you balance your family budget and say that was like the heart of your life?
No.
It's kind of a different thing, right? Statistics, you think? So if I were to come up to Tim, who kind of halfway raised his hand for math, and I'm like, Tim, I want to know you better. I want to understand who you are and what you're about. Would you give me statistics?
Yeah, you got a 34% percentage of probability for that.
34% probability. Here's the way it works for me. I think about it this way. Let's say I have a teenage daughter, because I will eventually, hopefully, God willing, and God forbid, and I loan her the car.
Oh, yeah.
No, they're better drivers.
They are? The girls are?
Yeah, you don't want to give it to your son.
So let's say I loan my daughter the car, and she brings it back, or I show up to the scene like this. What kind of question am I asking?
Whose fault?
Whose fault? That would be a big one.
Which one is yours?
Are you okay is a huge one.
That's the first one.
Huge one. You start there.
You have all faith?
Physically, where are you at? Do you have all state?
Like a good neighbor.
Was it your fault?
Here's the way the conversation
Which
goes.
one of those is yours?
As soon as she's fine, which you're hoping she is, what happened? The question you're asking is, I want to understand the story, right? I want to get it so I know how to respond. So think about it this way. She tells you the story. She says, Dad, I was trying to see how fast I could get the car up to, and I got to 110 on Clayton Road. You'd be proud of me. I mean, it's a story, right? My response to that is going to be pretty significant.
I need a DNA.
What happens if the story is, I was standing outside the car on the sidewalk when this happened. The dude driving the SUV was drunk. Very different conversation, right? What happens if she says, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, Dad. I was heading home. It's 10 o'clock and this is on the way to my house. I wasn't speeding. I had my seatbelt on, which is why I'm okay. Different conversations, right? The tone of the story completely changes the way that my role and my interaction with my daughter works. So I think it happens at the intimate moments like this. I think it happens at general basic moments. I see it on a daily basis as a cop. I walk into a household, and a lot of times, the person's perspective of me, or the way that they envision themselves in relationship to authority, affects my entire conversation with this person. So I worked in Antioch for a while, and there's a lot of people that came from inner city. And there's a lot of people that came from inner city that worked with cops who were just dirty, just not good guys. And I've heard of a few of them. I don't know any that I work with currently. But ultimately, I would approach people in Antioch who had dealt with people in Oakland and had dealt with people in San Francisco who said, you know, when I grew up in the projects, the cops would show up and they wouldn't even ask you questions. They would just beat you down. And then while you're laying there in your own blood, then they'd ask you questions. I don't know guys that work that way. But when I step in and I'm wearing a badge, they assume that I'm on that team, right? 90% of the time at the beginning of any call that I go to, what I have to do is I have to define the story. I have to tell them where I'm at, who I am, what the difference is. And half the time it's a battle because they're so ingrained in what they think is going on here that they think they know me. Well, they don't know me. So it's always an interesting conversation. I'll walk in, for example, we'll have 6 or 7 people fighting in a family. Well, it's normal for the family to fight. And cops sometimes will come in, and what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll throw people around and they'll assert their authority and those things. And you can do it. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you have to. But with me, I found the best thing that works is I'll walk into the main player, the person that's the loudest, and I'll walk right up to him and I'll say, man, are you all right? Do you need an ambulance? Do you want me to get you medical attention here? I mean, you're bleeding from your lip and everything. Are you physically okay? You need my help for anything? Is there anything you want me to do? And it completely changes his tone. Rather than running up to the dude and saying, get on the ground and being all authority-driven, which, again, sometimes you have to play that role. But a lot of the time, you can totally change the conversation based on the way that you walk into the circumstance, because you can tell them what the story is. Look, I'm showing up. I'm not showing up as a guy who has an ego. I'm not showing up as a guy who can trump you in your own household. I'm showing up as a guy that's here to help you in this situation. Even if you end up going to jail at the end of it, half the time I got the guys thanking me in the back of my car. It's kind of funny how that works, so that I find the story for them. I'm just here to calm things down so nobody gets really hurt. So, kind of an interesting thing. You guys seen Lord of the Rings?
Of course.
There's a guy that taught, one of the things that he taught is that we understand, our hearts are made to understand story. And so we kind of gravitate toward the great stories. When you read huge novels, there's elements of those novels that kind of go between those few. And Lord of the Rings is really good because it hits those main markers. And it goes along and it helps us to see life a little more clearly, because it kind of opens up those things that we're drawn towards, the larger story that we already know we're a part of, that we're searching for definition of. If you remember when they're first starting out, Sam is kind of like the level-headed, kind of not very educated guy that's extremely loyal, right? As they're starting off the story, his main question when they start seeing the resistance is, what kind of story am I in? It's kind of an interesting question to ask. And then as the thing goes on, Tolkien puts in a couple other ones. And there's a couple other places where he talks about the story they're in. And what he does is when Frodo loses his mind, he says things like, don't you understand, we're in an epic tale. We're in a story. This is what we're fighting for. So it's almost best illustration I've heard in a while. It's like you walked into a movie theater 45 minutes late sometimes in life, right? You show up on the scene, you kind of understand history, you kind of get who you are, you kind of get your family, but ultimately you miss the first 45 minutes, and so you spend your time trying to figure out what happened before in that prior 45 minutes that defines your current reality, so you know how to act in the middle. And a lot of times life looks more like improv acting, right? You jump into a scene and you kind of gather your elements and you say something funny or you say something inspiring. But it has to be the two, and that tends to be the way you live your life because you miss the first 45 minutes of that movie. So there's a lot of different competing ideas of this. You guys are seeing them around. This is one of them. Anybody seen this? Well, let me give you the intro to this, just so you guys can see it. See if I can get it to play right.
We are born to survive in a world full of danger. Hardship makes us stronger. We dream impossible dreams and make them real but we are not one. Mankind's struggles shape our destiny. And in those struggles, new worlds and new futures are born. Amidst the chaos of an unforgiving planet, most species will fail. But for one, all the pieces will fall into place. And a set of keys will unlock a path for mankind to triumph. This is our story, the story of all of us.
So if the way we understand life is story, think about the appeal of that series. I mean, listen to the story that they're telling. This is our story. This is everybody's story. This is the way we understand our reality. Well, if you go through and watch this show, there's a couple interesting things about it. First of all, it's very entertaining. I think it's good. I like the history aspects of it. A lot of like the inventors and things like that that go along the lines, the things that changed humanity for the better. A lot of fun highlights. Overarching theme, man is the one species that can survive all the elements of this unforgiving planet. So if we're to define the story we're in, we're just survivors. That's what we're doing. And we're the best of the survivors, so yay man. The one that I watched that was the most revealing of that was the one where they're dealing with the bacteria outbreaks that happen throughout humankind, and how our bodies adapted to fight off those bacteria. So even at the core of our DNA structure, our body's able to respond to challenges and overcome them. And then kind of the conclusion was, that's how we're made, so we need to be the overcomers as well. And then it's defined by battle is the other thing. So we're made to fight and we're made to survive, and that's just what we do. The other thing is, they don't approach the fact that every civilization since the beginning of time had a consciousness that there was something higher and bigger and God. They don't deal with religion because religion doesn't contribute to the story that they're trying to tell. So they tell you the portion that they want, and they define reality as surviving. Just thought it was kind of interesting because I have a tendency to default to the improv acting when I don't see clearly, and I have a tendency just to put my head down and fight through it and not think through what I'm doing. Does anybody else have that issue? You find yourself doing things for 2-3 hours and you're like, why did I waste my time? This wasn't important. I needed to be dealing with stuff with my kids or with my wife. And I tend to just put my head down and get through it. Well, that's kind of what it's promoting. Just survive and do it well. Just put your head down and get through it and fight for the sake of fighting. Anybody see the movie The Grey?
Yes.
Interesting flick. Thought it was pretty good. Anybody like it? The end was depressing.
Yeah.
So the poem, I looked it up because I was curious. I thought it was like some great poem that they had brought into a movie scene. Once more into the fray, into the last good fight I'll ever know. Live and die this day, live and die on this day. Now, I thought it was going to be like, Socrates or somebody, one of the great poets of our time. It ends up it's the movie writer who wrote it. He gave this statement, and this is the philosophy of the main character, Liam Neeson plays in it. Here's the basic outline. They fall out of the sky in a plane that crashes in the middle of remote Alaska, and they get hunted by a pack of wolves. Small community of guys, a couple of weapons, knives mainly, and they're in the territory of these wolves, and they're constantly being attacked by them, and the wolves are picking them off one by one. And he defines it right away. He studied wolf patterns. His job was to be up on the oil rigs, defending the place where they were drilling from the wolves, so he's a sniper. He's a pretty tough guy. But ultimately, when you ask him his life philosophy, it's essentially, I'm going to live in the moment, and I'm going to fight till the end. And that's it. You ask him why? I don't think he could tell you why. He has a couple of things in his past that he regrets. He's got a lot of shame that he carries around from family that fell apart. But ultimately, his one thing is, all I know is, on the last good fight, I am going to live and die in that moment. That's what I'm going to do. So the scene ends, the whole movie. I'm going to spoil it for you. Well, basically, I won't do it if you want me to. Here's the guy I want to talk about, different than that. One of the guys of his crew, okay? They're trying to survive. They're all getting picked off. They're dying one by one. It's a really depressing thing because it's almost like exhausting. You can't win. Everybody's falling apart. Everybody's dying. And one of his guys finally sits down on a log. Right in the middle of it, right? Well, the idea is you can't sit down because the wolves are going to eat you alive if you sit still for any minute at a time. So he sits down right next to a river here. He's kind of injured. He's had a rough life. He's been in and out of prison. He's on parole. doesn't really have a family waiting for him. And he sits on a log and he looks at that view. And the guy's like, what are you doing, man? We gotta go. We're trying to survive here. We're trying to fight. And he says, do you really think it's gonna get any better than this? And he just sits. And the guys are like, seriously, man, you're gonna die right here. He's like, I know, but why am I fighting? Why am I trying to survive this? He's like, look at this. I mean, I'm injured, I'm hurt. What do I have to go back to? An oil rig? I was going home to sleep with prostitutes and drink my head out. It's different. I was going to drain my gourd. He sits down and he's like, this view is the best that it will ever get for me. And I'm done. I'm going to toss in my chips. And he hands his wallet to them. One of the things Liam Neeson does, he collects IDs from everybody that he's around, so when he survives, he can come back and report to the families what took place. So he can track down. So when they're looking for survivors, he can solve that problem. Kind of a cool idea. So the question, obviously, that ran out of my head is, okay, there's a philosophy. Is that what you're fighting for? Are you fighting for the best that it's going to get? Because then the question becomes, once you reach that point, however you define that, then what? Is that retirement? I mean, think about it. You fight and you fight and you fight and you save money, you invest so you have everything you need, you can live where you want, you can do what you want, and then you get there, is that the best it's going to get? So then when you start seeing struggles in retirement, how do you live with that? Because if that's your story, that's your finish line, right? So I just thought it was an interesting philosophy. The question it brought up for me is, what are we fighting for? I mean, you guys woke up this morning, right? Anybody good at waking up? I'm not very good at that. It's kind of a battle, right? You step into the fight. And the question becomes, why are you waking up? Why are you going through life? What is it that you're fighting for? How do you set that backdrop? Or, another way to put it, since we understand life and story, is, what story are you playing a role in? Do you understand that? Do you even understand what it is you're fighting for? Or are you just sticking your head down and getting through it because you're a survivor? I think there is a greater story. Another movie that kind of illustrated that for me, did we see The Act of Valor? There's a scene in this movie right at the beginning. Oh, it's amazing. Absolutely amazing. I couldn't show it. It's like a 10-minute scene. If you guys haven't seen it, this movie's worth watching. Here's the intro line. They got this Navy SEAL, legitimate Navy SEAL. He's writing down a memoir before he goes off on a mission where he could possibly lose his life. And he's good with it. And here's what he writes. The dangerous life, he basically says, is sacred. He says, my dad told me when I was a kid, his dad was also a military man. You don't really get the intro to that. You live your life by a code, an ethos, every man does. It's your shoreline. It's what guides you home, and trust me, you're always trying to get home. And then it cuts to a scene where they're jumping out of a plane, training, skydiving for a mission they're about to go on. It's just phenomenal. So in the movie, they're battling a group of people from, I believe it's Costa Rica. It's down south in Latin America. They're terrorists, they're gun traffickers. Anyone opposes them, they go to the worst possible end in order to defend themselves. So they show you a scene where a suicide bomber, he grabs an ice cream truck, and he puts one of his female captives from their human trafficking trade inside of it, and they drive into the courtyard of a large school, and all the kids come running out to the ice cream truck, and then all it shows you is the explosion. And he blew up a politician who was opposing their drug trade. So here's the image of the man that they're fighting, right? Evil defined, right? Really clear picture of that. That's the guys they're going after. So right in the beginning of the movie, this is one of the reasons it's the best part. They don't save the action for the end of this thing. You're not waiting for the one final scene of it. It's throughout. You watch these guys living life and the story that they're playing a role in. So they go in after the CIA lady who was undercover with this organization, dismantling them from the inside. Well, she gets kidnapped in the middle of it, and she's being tortured at a camp that's way out in the middle of nowhere. And this camp is surrounded by people, and they have to go in and they have to rescue this lady from this camp. And they fly, they jump out of an airplane and they skydive and they fall into this area and they fight through the forest in the middle of the night and they show up right on the doorstep here, and then you watch the tactics, which are just flawless. They're phenomenal. And then their exit doesn't work. While they're running out, things are going wrong. The different places they were going to jump into boats doesn't work. They have to go to their third and fourth different outlets, and finally they give up on going to the fourth outlet. They just drive the truck into the water and swim to the boats. Well, as the boat's pulling, you notice there's a cavalryman. It's unbelievable. Gatling guns, 50 cal that are just spinning. It's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. And they absolutely annihilate this organization that wanted nothing more than to keep this captive. The reason I bring it up, this has a whole lot more characteristics of the story that we live in than the gray. The gray is the depression that you fall into. It's kind of the funk. We're just going to get through it. They have similar stories. They both fall out of the sky from an airplane. They fall into a life or death fight, and they all working together as a team to survive. That's general, works in both movies. The differences would be, it's not an accident, it's intentional. When they fall out, they know that there's something going on. They know they're in a part of a fight. They know why they're fighting. There's a purpose. In the act of valor, they're willing to die for it. They're putting their neck on the line for it, rather than the gray where all they're trying to do is not die. And it's considered valiant. So, the story that I want to talk about, we get to talk about the Bible, we get to talk about the Exodus. When I talk to you about the Exodus, it's not the children's movie, The Prince of Egypt. Okay? It's a different thing than that. This is the one story that God chooses as central to his covenant with mankind, as the atypical thing. So, this same God, the one who's telling the story, he's the same God beginning to end. He's Old Testament, New Testament. And the thing we're going to talk about is how we step into this story, what role he wants us to play in the middle of that. So last month, Steve walked us into creation, right? We have man created. We have man who falls apart. They're separated from community with God. That's what we were created for. And God makes a covenant with this guy, Abraham. And he says to Abraham, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and I will make your name great. And then the response is, you will be a blessing. And here's a promise he makes to Abraham, who's a random guy for the most part. He's a guy that had faith, who was consistent and loyal. He's kind of like a Sam. And he pulls him aside and he says, first of all, you're too old to have children, so is your wife. But I'm going to give you more kids than there are stars in the sky, and then there is sand on the shores. Now, the cool thing about that is God kind of knows where to flex, right? You don't want to bluff these kind of things, right? Well, man can't really do what God promised, right? God can do that. So he says, first of all, you're going to know it's me because there's no possible way that you could pull this off. Secondly, I'm going to pull it off. And the next thing that happens is he takes on the covenant on his own in front of Abraham. So the Abrahamic covenant comes together. God shows up. He tells Abraham, he tells him a story. Says Abraham falls asleep. He says, you're going to have all these kids. They're going to be more than the star. They're going to be more than the sand. And while Abraham's dreaming, here's what God shows him. 400 years, your descendant will be strangers in a country. This is before the Exodus story. And they're going to be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves. And afterward, they will come out with great possessions. Again, the slaves are going to win over the oppressing power. And the way you're going to know it's me is because there's no way the slaves could have pulled that off. And they're going to walk out like victors in the spoil. They're going to walk out with all the gold and riches that you could find. And then the significant part is when the sun was down, there's a flame that shows up. And during a covenant, they cut animals in half. They leave a path in the middle, which normally is where the blood drains. And then the two people that are making the agreement or the covenant would pass between those two pieces of a dead animal through the blood in the middle. And the communication was, I make this arrangement with you, and you and I both pass through this, and if I violate this covenant, may we end up like these animals are. Completely dead. Okay? Here's what God does. Abraham is resting. God passes through those animals on his own. The communication is, regardless of your part of this, I'm promising to death that this is what I'm going to stake my reputation on. I'm going to fulfill this. This is my heart for you as my creation. I own this 100%. So, we start with the Exodus story. They're in Egypt. They're in captivity. The way it gets there is Abraham has a couple sons, or he has one son, Isaac specifically, who before Abraham dies, after he gets this promise, first of all, he doesn't see millions of kids come out of his own body. He sees one son who gets married. That's the point that he gets to see. Following that, he has a couple other sons. They end up at a place where there's a famine in the land, and the political power that's ruling at the time is Egypt. And these people of Abraham, this community that's on the outskirts, flees to Egypt from the famine in order to survive. Well, it just so happens that God placed a guy named Joseph in leadership, who was from Abraham's seed, his descendant. He saves the people from famine. They show up. He's able to feed them in Egypt. They show up as refugees, and they're treated like royalty because they're associated with this guy Joseph. That's where we start. Well, this is where the prophecy comes in. God says for 400 years they're going to be held in captivity to the ruling power. Well, they had no economic freedom at that point because they couldn't farm the land. They're stuck underneath the oppression of this king. And over those 400 years, Joseph dies, The king who loved Joseph and the Israelite people die, and we end up in a place where the ruling power, the king of Egypt at the time, is scared of the number of, they call them Hebrews now, in the land, because they're going to take over his kingdom. So now, instead of being willing refugees, instead of taking on and being accepted by this community of people that had resources and being built up and being allowed to survive, now they're slaves and they're being oppressed. When they want to go out and worship their God for 3 days, they're not allowed. They're held into captivity in this city. So they're enslaved, they're inferior, they're socially oppressed and looked down upon. The Hebrew thing can be taken as a derogatory term. And spiritually, the way the community is set up is, Pharaoh himself is considered the God-man. He rules. He's over the top of all this stuff. There is no God above him. He defines the story. He's the one communicator for all of mankind. This is the story that you walk into. Well, it's interesting because this is the Abraham promise that these people have been waiting for, is that God's going to establish them as a great nation, where Abraham's going to have millions of kids and they're going to be a great nation, and God's going to give them everything they need, and they're going to bless others because they have so much they can't even contain it themselves. This is where we walk in at the story. They're slaves. They have been. They're 400 years down, and they're under a king who has full ownership of everything, impressing them. Doesn't look very good for them. That's the story we walk into. Not only that, we walk into the king deciding that they're so strong, they're going to start killing all the male babies. You guys remember that, right? That's not the pretty little thing that we imagined. It's genocide. They just do it at the earlier generations. There's literally blood in the water. Because what the king says is, throw the babies in the river. First of all, his soldiers go out. As soon as your wife is giving birth, they take your son, they slit his throat, and they toss him in a river. It's the same as a car bomb going off at a preschool, right? It's the same idea. This is like the ultimate evil. This is death. This is the opposing power. So from that situation, God hears their cry. And he remembers the promise that he made. So they struggle and they struggle and they struggle and they cry out to God and they say, God, we believe it. You promised this. We haven't seen it yet, but we're waiting for it. And God hears it and he remembers and he steps in on it. And here's what happens. Pharaoh sees Moses like the kid's story. He's just a pawn on a deck. He's a cartoon character. Just kill him and throw him in the ocean. He doesn't deal with them as human beings. He doesn't value the life that they have. He just wants them out so he can continue his reign of power. It's kind of like ivory tower stuff. Well, it's funny they named him Moses because he was drawn out of the river. And then God uses that to draw the people out of Egypt. So there's a lot of mirroring and images here. Not only that, his parents, they creatively opposed the government. Pharaoh said, throw your baby in the river. So they do. They just put him in a basket. And he floats down. Not only that, God kind of plays this joke on Pharaoh throughout. If you read it with an understanding that Pharaoh thinks he's God, but God really is God, what you watch is kind of like this communication that God has with Pharaoh, where he's convincing Pharaoh, you really don't have the authority that you think you have. I'm in charge of this. I'm going to take the most innocent representation of mankind, a baby, an infant, and when they throw him in the river, your daughter's going to pull him out. Not only that, he's not a cartoon character. This is a human being. This is my creation. This is the thing that I have made a covenant with that I want to survive, not under your authority and your power, but mine. I'm God. And he takes this baby who grows up in the kingdom. You guys know the story a little bit? We're going to race through it. I don't want to spend time on necessarily the individual elements because I can't get through the book that way. We're trying to look at this as a bigger story, right? We've got creation, we've got Abraham's covenant. God says they're going to be a great nation, and we're kind of at a crux where they're really not a great nation at this point. They're a bunch of slaves. And God says, I remember I made you this promise. We're still moving in this direction. In fact, here's the plan. We're going to go forward. This baby is going to become a prince, thus the prince of Egypt. And he's going to be powerful, and then he totally screws up. He falls apart. He murders one of the Egyptian guys because they're fighting with his people, the Hebrews, which he's kind of grew up in Egypt, but he knows he's from the background. And he takes off. And he goes off and becomes a shepherd. So he's a professional shepherd. There's a picture of a shepherd. So you get a picture of it. It seems kind of glamorous when you just mention the word, but it's a dude that hangs out with sheep all day. This guy's job is to make sure the sheep don't die. Okay, it's a McDonald's worker. I mean, it's low profile. It's not CEO. It's not executive. It's not great pay. It's you live off the land. You live off your sheep. Somewhat respectable trade depending on who you are. A lot of times it's the local drunk. He's out there doing that because he can be trusted to follow sheep around. God takes this guy and leads him back into Egypt and has him oppose the greatest economic and political and social power in the world. He tells him, by the way, you're going to go back and you're going to stand in defiance to what everybody, including your people, say is God. This guy Pharaoh is the reason that everything's going well. We trust him like he is from the cosmos, God himself. And you're going to oppose him and you're going to tell him, let us go. And Moses says, who should I say sent me? Because obviously I'm not going to show up to Pharaoh and say, as a shepherd, I tell you my authority that you're going to let these people go, right? Whose authority do I go under? This is where it gets interesting. He says, I will be what I will be. That's who you tell him sent you. It's kind of an interesting thing. He doesn't say, my name is Billy Jr., right? Think about what that would mean to you and me. What does Billy Jr. mean to you and me? If God were to give a name like Steve, what's the first thing that goes through your head with Steve?
Buckethead.
Everybody you know named Steve, right? When you're naming your children, do you remember this? Can we name our child Stephen? No, I knew too many just stupid Stevens. We can't really name him Stephen. Do you see what I mean? Like, we do that, right? We associate things with the name. God doesn't even give himself a name like that. He doesn't say, my name is Ed. Or he doesn't even say, my name is Jesus. He says it very differently. He says, first of all, I'm going to be a phrase, not a word. And my phrase is going to be, watch this. That's basically what he says is, I'm going to be defined. You are going to define me, not by a word, not by a name, not by Steve. You're going to define me by this phrase, which is, I'm going to be what I'm going to be. And then you get the Exodus story. So if you guys want to know the definition of God, it doesn't have a lot to do with the wording itself or the name itself. It has to do with the activity that he defines himself with through this Exodus story. Here's how you will know me. And it starts with, I am faithful and I will remember the promises that I made to you and to humanity in general. And I will redeem you. Not only that, I will take on the highest powers in all of the world and I will absolutely demolish them and set you free from everything that captivates you so that you can be what I intend you to be. This is the definition of the God who exists, who created things. He defines himself by his activity. You guys remember the plagues? Just so you understand it, I'm brushing over the top of things. If you go through each of the plagues, each of the different things that takes place here has a significance that goes into Egyptian culture that God is completely turning on its head. And the things that Pharaoh thinks that he has control of when he thinks that he's God, and the things that the community looked at Pharaoh to control, God shows he has zero control of. Because he's not God. So you go through the 10 plagues. The last one is utterly ridiculous, right? All of the Egyptian people, their firstborn dies. Their animals die. Not only that, the slaves, the subculture, the people that live in filth, their babies are fine. So whatever it is that's happening, it's favoring this group of people. And they are starting to say, Yahweh is our God. Who is Yahweh? Well, he's the guy that's going to draw us out of here because you think that you're God and you're not. So we're kind of at an epic battle. So God gets them out. Destroys Pharaoh's power. He leads them out of Egypt. Not only that, did you see the promise in the Abrahamic covenant before that I showed you? Not only are they going to leave when they want to leave, but they're going to leave with the spoils of war. Do you know what happened before this last plague? The community within Egypt was so scared of these people that God was favoring that they came out with offerings for them and they gave them all of their silver and gold. These people left wealthy from the nation of Egypt. Not only did they get out under God's authority, they got out as kings. They got out with as much property that they could handle because the Egyptians were like, here, just take this because obviously our God Pharaoh can't handle it, right? Your God wins. So not only does he take them out, but he fulfills what he promised initially. Not only am I going to make you a great nation, but you're going to come out with the spoils of war as a nation of slaves. You don't even have an army. You can't even fight for yourself. So they get out. God keeps teaching them. The way that I've heard it said before is God took Israel out of Egypt, but then he had to take the Egypt out of Israel. The idea is they were indoctrinated in this way of life. They were indoctrinated with Pharaoh as God, right? So they get out. What happens? Pharaoh doesn't give up. He still thinks he can hold on to it. For the life of him, he thinks he can hold on to it. He gets his army together thinking these guys don't even have weapons. They can't really defend themselves. We have chariots and thousands of men. He pursues them. And they get to the edge of the Red Sea. And God starts teaching Israel who they are, what their identity is. He says, first of all, shh. You're complaining. You're saying we're going to die. What'd you do? Bring us out here to kill us, God? And he's saying, shh. Be quiet and watch this. I will fight for you. He has them sit still while an army is bearing down. And then what does he do? He takes over God again. Here's Pharaoh who thinks he's God. That's fine. Let him come. We'll stage a battle in the Red Sea. We'll see how this goes for him. Right? They roll out in the middle of it. You guys remember it. The walls open up. Israel gets through clean, free, clear, on dry ground in the middle of a lake. Right? Pharaoh's like, well, if they can do it, I'm God. We control these things. They go in also. What happens? God himself drowns, according to Egypt. The person who they thought was God who had control of these things, not only does his family suffer, not only does all of his society suffer, he himself dies in the process. God is dead. Nietzsche was right in Egypt's context, right? God dies. He does it miraculously. So you would think this nation who's freed by God, who's cleared, who's emancipated, they're set free into the world, that they would trust this God, right? And they would follow him. The first thing they do is they get free, they're in the desert, they're going to the land that God says he's going to give them according to the promise that he made hundreds of years ago. And the first thing they say is, we're hungry. You bring us out here so we starve? At least in Egypt we had food, right? This is the story we're in the middle of. Do you guys relate to that? If you don't right now, do you have children that do? I'm taking my son to a field trip yesterday, right? We're in a car, we're going. He can't stop asking me, are we there yet? It's not good enough that we're listening to music that he wants, that we're telling jokes and talking about things in the car. He wants to know if we have actually arrived. So God, you promised you're taking us, not are we going to trust you, you're going to miraculously provide for everything we need, but we're hungry. At least in Egypt we had food. So God shows himself again. I'll provide for you. Here comes the quail. They have birds that fly over, they get killed. They get miraculously fed in the middle of a desert. What's the next thing they do? We're thirsty. At least in Egypt we had water. Under the control of Pharaoh we were fed and we had drink. So Moses, what's wrong with you? Not only did you lead me out by this. This is where you see the slave and the people. This is kind of the indoctrination they're under. They're not really like the super highly educated. They're not able to step back and look at the big picture and the story. They're just kind of putting their head down and getting through things because that's the story they've been told to follow. So God has Moses go up to a rock in the middle of the desert and strike it with a stick, and out comes a spring enough to feed an entire nation of people in the middle of the desert. And it's like, guys, do you get it yet? I told you who I was. I told you the story that you're in. You're the people that I promised I would take out of this. This is your story. And they're still trying to get back into this slavery. And then there's the Ten Commandments, right? This is the Exodus story. We're going through it at fast pace. The Ten Commandments isn't a list of rules, if you guys are missing it. You got to understand the context of the story. First of all, it's not rules, it's words, which is different. They're words that are spoken from God. Not only that, he sets it up ahead of time with them. He tells them, look, I led you out of Egypt. I have these plans for you. This is what I want to make you as a nation. If I promise this, will you follow my instructions so I can get you there? So I can teach you not to be these slaves who are oppressed in this small little story that teaches you to put your head down and walk through things just because you're a slave. I will teach you the bigger story. I'll show you that I am God and not the person who thought he was over the top of you. And then I'll teach you how to be a community of people that doesn't oppress people. So you have the Ten Commandments. Jesus sums them up. Love the real God. Only him. Not the people that think they're an authority over you. And then love the people you're around. Take care of your family. Take care of your wife. Don't be stealing from each other. Don't be killing each other. Act like I do toward you. I'm here to redeem you. I'm here to save you. Mirror me. Good illustration we have. I'm using the word emancipation. It's probably the most recent-ish massive story that we understand. You guys remember Frederick Douglass? Slave, set free in the midst of it. This is kind of a little a cartoon about him, but essentially, he's a good stereotypical slave. He's somebody who was combined into this tiny little story that was, you were a slave, act like it. And when he didn't act like it, he was beat down every time. So he runs away from home. They send him to the slave master, who's depicted in the show here. And the guy just proceeds to beat the character out of this guy. Don't stand up. Don't have your opinion. Put your head down and do what I tell you to do. And then when he's in the middle of it, he beats him anyways. The phrase at the top was the key for me. You've seen how a man was made a slave. You can watch that process. That's pretty simple. You see how Egypt did it. They're dependent on him, and they changed their loyalties to being loyal to Egypt. But now let me show you how a slave was made a man. So he proceeds to beat the tar out of the slave master who before was seen as the god over him. Not only that, he beats up his friend. He says he went at it for 2 hours with this guy. And at the end, he walks away the victor. And in the middle of it, it's funny, one of the things he says is, I don't know how I had the strength to get through that sort of a battle. I think I understand the word that God is teaching through this. The thing that he's explaining is we're not made to be slaves. The story that we're a part of, guys, is not this tiny little keep your head down, work your way through things. The story we're a part of is a much larger story. It's a story of God who defines himself as the emancipator. For lack of a better word, he's the one who sets us free from anything that oppresses us. He defines himself, his name, on that activity. So for Israel, this isn't just terminology. What was Israel enslaved by? Do you see the picture now? Economically, could they go anywhere? They were held captive to Egypt by economics. Socially, they're looked on as lesser than men. Politically, they have no pull. They're the lowest of the low. Not only that, they're not even willing captives. They're being forced into the place that they're in. And God frees them from that. Because that's who he is. That's the way that he operates. And then he defines their reality. This is who you are. This is what you need. You need to be freed. You were made to be free. You were made to pursue what I created you for. And then the third thing that happens is the key. This is the thing I want to talk to you guys about. After he gives them this identity as people who are freed by God, he gives them an identity which mirrors his. Not only am I going to set you free, but I'm going to expect you to be freedom bringers. You're going to be my people that set other people free. You have a role to play in this. So again, we're backing up again. The story that we're in, this Exodus story, you guys need to go back and pay attention to it. This is the key to Jesus. This is the key to Old Testament, New Testament. This is the key to Revelation. This is the story that God defines himself by. He keeps retelling it over and over and over again in different terminology, in different contexts, and different stories. But we're intended to be people who mirror God's identity. We're supposed to be people who bring freedom. It's a simple thing to understand. But I want to illustrate it in a way you guys might be a little bit closer to home. And we're going to wrap up here on that. You guys remember the real estate bubble? So here's a story that will help you see it. A guy illustrated this way. Here's the idea behind being freed in order to free other people. So once upon a time, there were certain banks who, through their own great folly, find themselves in danger of collapse. Sound familiar? Under mountains of toxic debt that they could not repay or even understand. So they went to their governments, who had mercy on them and took their debts away with thousands and billions of dollars taken from their taxpayers. You guys been to that story, right? You understand that story. We've lived that story in the past how many years? So that's our context right now. So here's what the banks do. This is the don't do this part of this. So then those same banks, they came across many individuals whose taxes had rescued them, who owed them small debts of a few $1,000s compared to their billions. And they showed them no mercy at all. In fact, they took away their homes because they couldn't pay. Does that sound familiar? Okay. This is an example of what not to do, of how your identity gets wrapped up in what you're experiencing from God himself. He frees you so that you can free other people, not this. Do you see this and you automatically go, what is wrong with that dynamic? What's wrong with that picture, right? If you're set free by these people, why are you now oppressing them? So guys, here's where we stand. We have a God who offers us freedom from anything that would hold us back and enslave us from what he said, from what he wants from us. He calls us to do things and then says, I will provide every need that you have in order to accomplish those things. The one thing that he desires from us is that we be people that bring freedom in the way that he brought freedom. He establishes Israel in the desert as a nation of people that will not act like Egypt. Some of the rules that he establishes right at the very beginning of the community is, when you have somebody who comes to you, Israel, when you're doing well and you're established, and they're foreigners, you don't treat them like you got treated when you were Hebrews. You accept them into your community. You make sure they have food and a house and a place to be. Not only that, every 7 years, we're going to throw a party, and we're going to celebrate this God who's a redeemer. They're going to call it Jubilee. And we're going to forgive every debt and every slave, and we're going to celebrate the fact that God forgave every debt and set us free from Egypt. He sets up a community that's established by his identity. You are going to be my representatives to this world. If this is God's story, if God's story is, I set you free, and we're to take part in that story, our job is to be people who set people free. And it's not just a basic pray a prayer of salvation and get welcomed into a church community who likes you. It's a much broader difference than that. Think about the things that hold you back right now. I mean, the word slavery is kind of a big word. I don't think we're necessarily enslaved. But how many of you are servant to your debt? You feel that? This is one of those things that you're able to bring to God, and you can actually be stewards of the money that you're given, and God can help you move through that. The more important ones are more spiritual debt. What are the type of things that you are masters to, that you think are the most important things? What are the things that you're fighting for? What is your list? Because if it's anything other than Yahweh, if it's anything other than going after God, at the end of it, all you're trying to get to is the best point, right? It's kind of like the guy who sat down on the log. Once you've arrived, it's kind of empty, even if you accomplish it. God says, I've created you for something entirely different. I will set you free from those things. I will make you blessed as a nation so that you can be a blessing to the people that are around you. So the challenge is, where do you fit in this dynamic? First of all, what story do you think you're in? What are you fighting for? Why are you waking up in the morning? And then put yourself in this dynamic. Do you understand? Do you know the God who is the one who sets people free? Do you have an understanding of who he is? If you don't, this is where we begin today. This is the God who created all people and all things. This is the God you need to know. Secondly, if you've been freed, if you've been emancipated, what does that look like in your life? Are you still pursuing things that are holding you back? Are you still stuck in ruts? Because this is the God who wants to not only lead you out of Egypt, he wants to establish us as a community of people that are freed from the same type of things that enslave everybody else. We're supposed to be different so that we can influence the other people. And that's the last part. How are you freeing others? What does that look like in modern day? So I wanted to tell you a story that I've noticed for me. And then I'm going to show you a video and let you guys kind of sit with it for a little bit. I had a call the other day as a cop. I always tell cop stories because people tell me I have to when I'm here, so I guess I'll tell you another one. We got a call to a hotel. Lady says, my boyfriend's beating me up. Happens quite a bit. We see it quite a bit. A lot of times it's around drugs, it's around alcohol. So you tend to just kind of fly into it and you deal with the crisis at the moment. Here's what we have. We have a lady who needs a hospital visit. We have a man who needs a jail visit. We'll go take care of both needs, right? So that's kind of what you walk into. Well, I walk in, and this girl is different than normally what you walk across. She's wearing a ridiculous amount of clothing, meaning a little bit of it. And she just looks like she is torn up. Like she's been on drugs for years. Like she's just hurting. And she's just like slumped over and down and out. And I ask her what happened, and she says, my boyfriend beat me up. So I'm looking at it, and I'm like, you know what? I think I get what you're doing. I think I understand who you are. And so I try to build somewhat of a relationship with this lady. Okay, I'm kind of questioning because I see how you dress and the way you're acting. I have a feeling maybe this is not your choice of vocation, but I think I know what you do. So why don't you spill it? No, he's just my boyfriend. He's just my boyfriend. He beat me up. So look, I can help you. Okay? I'm somebody who has great resources. I know this territory really well, and I'm not somebody who wants anything from you. So you can talk to me, okay? Let me help you with what I have. Don't go back to that. You're enslaving yourself to that. Let me show you the path out of this. Let me help you. I try to convince her. It takes me probably 15, 20 minutes. I finally convince her. She says, okay. Do you see the tattoo on my back? I said, yeah. It says J Hype. It says, that's his name. why did he tattoo his name on your lower back right by the tram stand? Well, that's his branding. That's his serial number for me. So people know who I am. I work for him. You guys getting the image? Not only that, this has been going on for years. Okay, well, tell me your story. I want to hear what happened with you. I want to understand how you've put yourself in this position. Well, she was a foster kid. She went to a modeling shoot at 15 years old because she wanted to be a model. She didn't have a lot of oversight. She didn't really have a family. The foster home sends her into a modeling shoot. She says she wound up surrounded by 10 large men, all of which said, "You will work for us or we will kill you right now." And then they handed her newspaper articles of dead girls that came out across the news and said, "This is what we do to people who don't do what we say." And at that point, she was kidnapped by this group, and she was fed drugs, and then she was expected to work for this group. And that had been her reality for 10 years. And this is the girl I'm sitting with. I mean, that's captivity at its best, right? Not only that, I'm not in Africa. I'm not in South America. I'm sitting in Concord, right? This is my doorstep. You think we're emancipated, right? We're free from slavery. I'm telling you we're not. And I'm telling you this happened last year to one officer in one area who actually took the time, rather than just blowing it over and getting it done, to figure out what was actually happening. That it's happening here and it's happening now. So this is my friend now who I turn over to domestic violence advocates and people who intercede and try to get her housing for the night, and it's a really rocky path, because you can set her free from that, which I did to the best of my ability. I eliminate the male who had the authority over her, and then I'm able to kind of set her out on her own. Say, let's get you clean, let's get you educated, let's get you going. Well, just like when Israel got out of Egypt, you couldn't get the Egypt out of them. They were still stuck in this whole, this is how I made my money. This is how I feed myself. This is how I take care of myself. This is who I understand myself to be, is this person. So we're in the midst of that battle, which is going to be a while. Luckily, I teamed up with a detective who has a heart for these girls and is a female detective, which helps a lot, because this was a hard conversation to have with a lady, as a cop to begin with, but then secondly as a male, who all she knows of males is her stepdad, who was a part of this as well. She called him stepdad. So she's currently on the path to that. There's some really good stuff that happened. The guy who we arrested is looking at 10 years in prison. Feels like a success. It feels like a drop in the bucket compared to what he should have. We had 2 other girls that he was also working that testified against him. Halfway. One of them didn't. She lied about the whole thing, but she had earlier made a statement that we recorded. It worked really well. Ultimately, a huge success. For me, in the role that I'm given to play right now, this is one of the areas where I'm able to see literally the way that God has freed me up so that I can free other people. And so this is, not to use myself as the example, but I wanted you guys to see this as a personal thing for me. I'm not just showing you something that defines God's reality and encouraging you to see the story for yourself. I'm telling you, this is something that you should be taking a part of in your kids' lives right now. You don't let them head in directions that will enslave them. You teach them that they're free people, that they're called by God, that they're able to pursue the things that God has for them. They're not held back by these things. And then the second reason I use the illustration is, this is a problem in our society today. This is a group of people that are enslaved, is this girl and the people that she represents within our community, and we tend to think it's outsourced and it's overseas. And I'm telling you it's not, and it's a recent discovery that we're dealing with right now. And so I want to appeal to you guys to watch this and allow God to use this to be something that prompts you, maybe not in this specific arena, but as something that you understand is right and that should be done. So this is a film I want to kind of have it illustrated. It's called Back to Innocence. It's written by a group that's dealing with slavery today, that's dealing with human trafficking, and it illustrates what I'm trying to say. And the big thing is I want this to resonate in the back of your mind. And I want you to take on the people that are a part of this and the heart that God has for them, so that you're not able to sit still and not be the person that you're called to be if you're free. So this is the things that we're called to be a part of.